Hi, everybody. I hope you're well. Hope you're keeping safe and sound. I'm Benji Fisher. Welcome to episode 3 of the podcast. Before we get into the podcast, I just wanted to share a little bit of an update on what we've been up to so far. So, we've had some amazing feedback from yourselves, our listeners. It's been really, really great to see. So, thank you so much for your support, and we really do appreciate it. We've tried to mix up this episode a little bit. We've tried to change the style of the episode. So, we really do want to hear your feedback on whether you felt that this episode was better in terms of the style, or whether you preferred the earlier format where we interviewed someone throughout the whole session and really didn't interrupt it. Also, something we've been a little bit absent on has been social media from the past few episodes, and we've started to think about how we can build a bit of a virtual community online where we share stories of our elderly heroes. So I have a small request for you if you want to engage with us. And I'd love to begin a conversation together with you online around any of the lessons you might have learned from this podcast or any previous episodes, and maybe some of the things you've been applying to your life. If you know any elderly family member, friend, community member with an interesting story worth sharing, please do also let me know too. So you can engage with us on Facebook at Their Lives. We don't have too many likes yet, but we hopefully will get that up. And our personal Twitter handles at Benji_Fisher and at Benji Hire. Pretty easy, we've both got the same name. We're both very new to this, and we're just trying to improve the podcast incrementally. So please do let us know your feedback. It is incredibly valuable to us. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce the episode. Today is about a specific theme, actually, and that is on community and getting through adversity. And I interviewed a close family member of mine, David Busse, a little bit about his life growing up in the 60s and 70s and how he progressed through his career and why his community was so important to him. So I hope you enjoy the episode and stay in touch.
Well, in the early 50s, I guess I was just an ordinary young boy playing football in the street with no cars on the street. And my parents, with their German accents, I was the son of German immigrants. And really, it was very straightforward. My life going to a local primary school was uncomplicated. And I had no real problems. One important thing is that my Jewish identity was not clearly established, shall we say, until perhaps I was the age of 8, when my brother had his bar mitzvah. I had no concept, I had no understanding of what Jewish was. In fact, it's true to say I probably didn't even know I was Jewish up to the age of 8. That was of no consequence in the sense that it didn't seem to matter. I had my mates in the street, I had my mates in the local primary school where I went, Glebe. The only difference between me and the other boys was that at 4 o'clock or 3:30 in the afternoon, when we left the school, a lot of the boys would say, "Where are you going?" And I would say, "Well, I'm going home to my mum." I said, "Why? Where are you going?" They said, "Oh, I'm going to me nan." Very interesting concept that, because the word nan, I don't think I even knew what the word nan was. Of course, it meant their grandparents, which was one indicator to me as to why early on I didn't have any grandparents.
I think many of us take for granted how much we actually question things and challenge people, no matter their seniority, their age, their position, and that was just not something that was commonly done back in that day. But David, he started to think about those sort of questions. He started to think outside the box.
Life continued. After my early life in, say, up to the age of bar mitzvah, by then I'd joined my secondary school. I had skills in certain levels, but perhaps not in others. 2 of the levels were maths, and one of them was French. Quite interesting, because I excelled at French. My later in life ability to be able to mimic was obviously a hangback to that time, when obviously I had a very good ear for accents. And so it came to 1963, when I left school with my then GCE, and I went to at a very young age of 16, I was about to leave school, start my working life, and do part-time day release in the world of mechanical engineering. Why mechanical engineering? Probably my father was an influence on me, having been an engineer all his life and a design draftsman, and it seemed to me the thing to do. I started work as an apprentice, but I had no notion of what life should be there. In other words, my parents were what they were as German immigrants. All I want to say is that for me personally, I had a wonderful young life as a young boy and an early teenager growing up. And for me, it wasn't the brown suitcase going up on the Met Line to town as an articled clerk. It was to work in a dirty engineering workshop and learn the basic skills of mechanical engineering. And one of the interesting anecdotes was when I was working in the design office there was, obviously I was on a drawing board, old-fashioned drawing board with a T-square and set square and pencils and different things. And I was following what my father was doing. It seemed quite natural for me to do that. Until one lunchtime, about 2 o'clock, I saw this chap coming out of a Ford Cortina, which was definitely the car of the day, and wearing a dark suit and a thin black tie, as they did in the 60s in those days. And I said to one of my pals, I said, "What does that chap do?" And they said, in a rather sort of disparaging tone, they said, "Oh, him, he's in sales." So, of course, I thought in a rather crude way, I think I'm going to have a bit of that. And so from there, really, we're talking about 1967, when I finished my apprenticeship in those early days with some basic yet very valid qualifications in mechanical engineering. I got an offer to be an estimating engineer for a company in Euston Road.
So there was something very interesting about the early part of my interview with David. Like many other young people back in those days, he would follow the family job. But actually, it was in the 50s and the 60s we saw that true emergence of capitalism and this idea that people could become who they wanted to be. And David was a fantastic indicator of this slow change in the 60s and how he managed to transition into a role in sales. Now, this title of sales was very new for the 20th century. You never really had a specific title, sales.
I passed my ONC, Ordinary National Certificate in Mechanical Engineering, and I embarked during my apprenticeship on an HND, a Higher National Diploma. And I achieved 2 years of that Higher National Diploma before, I flunked it. I was out. I didn't complete it. And that is one of the regrets, that I didn't go on to become what might be classified as a professional engineer, as opposed to the route I went. However, I would say to you that every decision I've made, and I'm proud of, is going back to a maxim that a famous industrialist once used, Sir John Harvey Jones, when he wrote his first book that was titled Making It Happen. And I guess that's always been my maxim in life. I don't wait for anybody. I don't wait for anything. I try to make my own opportunities and seize them when they present themselves. I always try to use what I call an initiative trail, which would make me perhaps different to some of my contemporaries in trying to investigate my way through things. For example, if I didn't know something, I would always be sure to ring up a company and find out about their manufacturing techniques, about their openings and about their systems, in order to equip myself with the right tools that I needed to get on. And gradually I moved up from being a junior representative to being a senior representative, to being a senior sales manager, to being a sales director, until ultimately I was running my own company. If you were example, you were selling, I don't know, pumps. That was a particular side of my sphere of expertise. If you were selling pumps into the fish industry, let's just say, call it an industry, the fish industry, I would make sure that I knew everything I could about the fish industry to use the language of the fish industry to whom the people that I was addressing. So in other words, being switched on to the subject matter that you want to investigate is very much part of it. It's no point just bringing up a company and say, do you have any opportunities? You need to make your opportunities by being canny, by being inquisitive and being informative to show people that you know about their business rather than just saying, is there an opening available? You need to get your foot in the door by becoming equipped with the right language skills in order to help you be recognized as somebody who has a good appreciation of that particular industry.
So, in the face of adversity, David didn't necessarily give up. Instead, he actually adapted how he went about doing things, and in the face of failure, he found himself pivoting. So, the lesson that we took from that was that actually failure doesn't always mean it's the end of the line. Instead, it actually means that it could just open up a new direction for one to explore. Another important point that he made was how he undertook a deeper level of learning in a new area. And this didn't mean that because he'd started out as an engineer, he always had to remain an engineer. Life is like a game. A really beautiful and quite poignant analogy someone once told me was, life is like a game of snakes and ladders, one could say. Sometimes it might be better to actually go down the snake in order to take a couple of steps forward and reach the ladder that excels you all the way to the top. And that is what I interpreted from David's messaging there. He changed himself, he learnt the language of a new role, and he excelled at that. After talking to me about his early career, David then went on to talk about the community that he'd formed in the early 70s with those around him that he lived by in his neighbourhood and the importance of the Jewish community that supported him through the years.
In 1969, Wendy and I were married, and in short words, we bought a house in Vista Way in Kenton, which was about 300 meters away from the Kenton Synagogue. And so our Jewish life, as it were, began. And then I started to go to shul. A friend of mine had lost his mother recently, and I knew her. And I said, well, what are you going to do now? And he said, well, I've got to go to the synagogue on the Sabbath and say the Kaddish. And I sort of said, what's that all about? Because I was completely zeroed out in terms of my Jewish life. And so the combination of that and going to shul on Shabbos to be with my friend, to support him, I didn't know what was going on in the shul service very much. And so I had to go on a big learning curve. And from there we had, in 1973, the arrival of Jeffrey Shizler, Reverend Jeffrey Shizler, now Rabbi Jeffrey Shizler, who gave us really early basic Judaism sort of classes during the week and also on Shabbat after the service. But I was still very nervous about it because I knew so very little. So I had to literally pick myself up from the floor. And then Jonathan was born in 1973. You know, there was a slow, steady climb, for me, a long climb. What I enjoyed about my early journey to Judaism was the feeling of camaraderie with other young Jewish couples who were in a similar situation to me. And there were lots of those who were a similar learning curve to me. They knew very little. I mean, I knew virtually zero. They might have known a little bit more. And then there were some guys who were what I call on the more knowledgeable side of Judaism, who'd gone to Jewish schools, even in those early years. They got to Hasmonean and JFS. I had neither of those opportunities, so they knew a whole lot of stuff. And some of them had miraculous knowledge that I was in awe of. But I was very much on the first step of the ladder.
Of the many people I've spoken to throughout this podcast, something that has constantly come up as a really important factor in all the individuals I've spoken to was their sense of community, their sense of common unity around a familiar thread, around a familiar theme. To me, I think the reason why community had seemed to be so important to David was because it was a platform for him to become more courageous and larger in his outlook on life. The importance of community helped David establish a sort of a peace amongst his inner friendship circle, and this sense of togetherness allowed him to know that he had neighbours and friends that he could fall back on and be dependent on when it came to the care of the family that he was starting to build. And we're seeing during this time communities coming together more so than ever. We spoke about it in our last podcast, and we're addressing it again. This idea that our older generation really felt that community was very important to them, and it is hopefully something that many of us will start to realize as well.
During those years from 1973, there was, of course, Jonathan's bar mitzvah, there was Michelle's bat chayil, and there was Laura's bat mitzvah, coupling onto all that. And sadly, the year after Laura's bat mitzvah was a major stepping stone in my life when my mother suddenly passed away, which I did not expect her to pass away, in the sense that I didn't realize that she'd been perhaps in a frailer condition that I thought she was. That then made me have to commit to other religious observance, in the sense of I had to go to shul early in the morning to say the Kaddish, and to fill in every morning and go to the early morning service. And slowly but surely, I became aware of some of the procedures that were necessary in the early morning service. And eventually one of the senior chaps said to me, go on, you take the service this morning. And I said, me? He said, well, we'll start you in a very basic part of the service, just so you say a few brachas, a few prayers, and so that'll lead you up. And that's exactly what happened. And then eventually I started to take the early morning service, the afternoon service, and the evening service. And I thought, blimey, this for the boy from Queensbury who knew absolutely zero. At least in my mum's honour, I'm moving on. And so what mattered? Well, what mattered was being part of a community where everybody went to the synagogue on the Sabbath, in what I called a community which I'd never previously experienced, was quite something for me. And then with my newfound knowledge, it became such an item that some of the young guys in shul would say to me, David, can you show me the right page that we're on, please? I think I knew at that time that I'd made my own mini mark. And, I just felt as though my life had moved on. And I do take great pride in that. And that gave me a lot of confidence to do more with my life in other aspects of my life. Perhaps that's what one gets from that experience. It gives you a great deal of confidence.
And this community continuously supported David and gave him that courage. And he transferred that courage to his career in the business that he built completely from scratch by himself. In the latter years of his life, he sold that business and started to look for other opportunities where he could get involved in.
And I saw this advertisement. It said, wanted, somebody with experience in the food industry with a background in commerce who speaks a foreign language. And I shouted down to Wendy, I can't believe this advert. And sure enough, it was an advert for KLBD. KLBD stands for KosherLondon Beth Din, and it was to sell kosher certification for ingredients and raw materials. So I met he's still my mentor, my boss, my manager, my colleague, Russell Brown. And we met in a cafe and we hit it off straight away. And I could see that we were going to be working very well together. So I worked 4 days a week for about 2 or 3 years, until eventually, as is the case today, I work 1 day a week as a consultant to KLBD. And it was there that I had the opportunity to travel to exhibitions worldwide, food exhibitions, to meet new prospects. I was a little bit of a wise guy, I suppose, knowledgeable in knowing how to deal with people. And I think that has been probably one of the most exciting aspects in my working life, being able to culminate all my experiences in a job like that, and that I'm still doing today. But it's been perhaps the culmination of everything that I've done in my life that KLBD has presented me with. And I'm very, very proud of everything I've achieved for them, and how it sort of tops out my career in a very interesting way.
And this is exactly why we decided to speak to David, because of the change in how his life started out to where it is today. When he was younger, he didn't realize the importance of community. When he was younger, he wanted to be an engineer, but actually, he started to develop passions over time as he grew his family and he grew his career, and it all culminated into a combination of both his passions. We ended the interview with a couple of funny jokes and spreading some humour. David is a very humorous individual, and it was a pleasure to speak with him.
I've always been a bit of a mimic because, I've always been very good at accents, I can speak in either Russian, if you like me to speak in the Russian accent, or I can speak in German, like me Germans always speak in German. So I had this ability to be able to imitate different accents and different actors that I performed as part of a group alongside my mentor, John Smerin, who produces all these events. And it's been a very exciting and rewarding part of a late end in my sort of life and my acting capabilities that otherwise I was never able to assume. And people always expect a quip or a joke out of me about some aspect of life. And it's been an enhancement in my life. There's no doubt about it. It was something that's tagged onto my life, considering how I started off as that little shy boy in Queensbury in Winchester Road who knew nothing about anything, let alone being Jewish.
So that wraps up this week's interview, and it was with David Busse. And it's just been so nice speaking to so many different people from a diverse range of backgrounds, experiences. What I will take from this podcast episode is 3 key things. Number 1, don't let failure get to you. Sometimes there might be an opportunity that presents itself that you never even expected was there. Number 2, make sure you surround yourself in a community. David was very much involved in his Jewish community. Other people we've been speaking to are very much involved in their local communities. Some people, they're involved in a community that is around an interest, like David Busse, who was one of the biggest magicians in the world. And number 3, always try and look on the brighter side of life. We're living in some really difficult times right now, but David maintained that comedic flair and enthusiasm, and he was an absolute joy to speak to. Thank you once again for listening to their lives. Like I said at the beginning of the episode, please do engage with us on social media. If you want to be part of our virtual community, sharing the lives of our elderly heroes, you can get in touch with me at Benji_Fisher, or you can connect with us on Facebook at Their Lives. Also, on our blog, you can now subscribe to get the exclusive updates as soon as we release every single episode. So please do subscribe if you're enjoying these episodes, and please do let us know your thoughts. Do stay safe, do stay well, and we'll see you in the next episode.